Rome, 150 BC. The harvest is over. Across the hillsides of Campania, the vines have been stripped bare. Thousands of dark grapes, still warm from the afternoon sun, are piled into wide stone vats cut directly into the earth. Men with bare feet and rolled tunics step in, and they begin to walk. The sound is wet and rhythmic. The smell is overwhelmingly sweet, almost violent in its intensity. Purple juice runs down channels carved into the stone floor, pooling into clay vessels the size of a grown man, buried neck-deep in the ground to keep them cool. No barrels, no glass bottles, no corks, no temperature-controlled cellars. Just grapes, stone, clay, and the knowledge of exactly what to do next, knowledge that had been building for 3,000 years before this moment. This is how Rome made its wine, and the story of how they did it is stranger and more sophisticated than anything the modern world gives them credit for. We think of wine as ancient, and it is. But what most people do not realize is that the wine of ancient Rome was almost nothing like the wine sitting in your glass right now. It was thicker, stronger, often sweetened with lead, frequently mixed with seawater, seasoned with pine resin, honey, herbs, and spices that would make a modern sommelier physically recoil. And yet it was everywhere, consumed at every meal by every class in every corner of the empire. Soldiers drank it on the march. Slaves drank it in the fields. Emperors bathed in the finest vintages while philosophers argued about which region produced the superior grape. How did a civilization without barrels, without bottles, without any of the tools we associate with winemaking, produce and distribute wine across an empire that stretched from Britain to Babylon? The answer involves engineering, obsession, and one of the most dangerous ingredients ever added to a drink in human history. Wine did not begin with Rome, but Rome perfected its production, distribution, and cultural centrality in a way no civilization before it had managed. The Romans inherited their winemaking knowledge from the Greeks, who had inherited it from the Phoenicians, who had carried the tradition from the ancient Near East, where grape cultivation had begun as far back as 6000 BC in the region of modern-day Georgia and Armenia. By the time Rome was a republic, around 500 BC, wine was already deeply embedded in Mediterranean culture. But it was during the height of the Roman Empire, roughly 200 BC to 400 AD, that wine production reached an industrial scale that would not be seen again in Europe for over 1,000 years. The Roman agricultural writer Columella, writing in the 1st century AD, dedicated entire volumes to the science of viticulture, the cultivation of grapes. He wrote with a precision and seriousness that reads more like a modern agricultural manual than an ancient text. Soil acidity, vine spacing, pruning angles, harvest timing. Romans did not simply grow grapes. They studied them, argued about them, and classified their wines with a sophistication that rivals anything produced today. The great wine regions of the Roman world were concentrated in central and southern Italy, Campania, Latium, and Etruria. Though as the empire expanded, viticulture spread into Gaul, Hispania, North Africa, and the Rhine Valley. Some of these regions, Bordeaux, Burgundy, the Moselle, are still among the world's most celebrated wine-producing areas today. The Romans planted the first vines there. Wine was not a luxury in Roman society. It was infrastructure. It was the primary safe drinking liquid for the entire population. Roman water supplies, while impressive by ancient standards, were not reliably clean. Wine, particularly when diluted, was bacteriostatic, meaning it inhibited the growth of the microorganisms that made water dangerous. Every Roman, from emperor to slave, consumed it daily. The Roman military ration included a measure of posca, a diluted vinegar wine mixture, as a standard daily allowance for every soldier in every legion. Roman wine bore almost no resemblance to what fills modern bottles. The base product, fermented grape juice, was the same. Everything else was different. To begin with, Roman wine was dramatically stronger than modern wine. Grapes grown in the intense Mediterranean sun produced higher sugar content, which converted to higher alcohol during fermentation. The resulting wine was often thick, syrupy, and viscous, more like a concentrated must than a light table wine. Romans almost never drank it undiluted. Mixing wine with water was standard practice, and drinking unmixed wine was considered a sign of either barbarism or dangerous excess. The flavor profile was nothing like what we recognize today. Into their wines, Romans routinely added honey to sweeten, seawater or salt to preserve and balance, pine resin to stabilize and add flavor, a practice that survives today only in Greek retsina, and a rotating cast of herbs and spices including coriander, pepper, saffron, and roses. The most prized Roman wine was a variety called Falernian, produced on the slopes of Mount Falernus in Campania. Ancient sources describe it as amber-colored, intensely aromatic, and so high in alcohol that it could be set alight. Pliny the Elder, Rome's great natural historian, described Falernian as the only wine in the world that could catch fire from a flame held near it. Whether this was literal truth or poetic exaggeration, it tells us something important about how Romans perceived the best of what their vineyards could produce. At the other end of the scale was Laura, a thin, sour wine made by soaking pressed grape skins in water and fermenting the result. This was the wine of slaves, laborers, and the very poor. It was barely wine at all, more a sour, mildly alcoholic liquid that was safer to drink than standing water and cost almost nothing to produce. Between Falernian and Laura lay the entire social spectrum of Roman life, expressed in what you drank and how you drank it. The Roman grape harvest, called the Vendimia, was the most important event of the agricultural year. It began in late September and ran through October, timed precisely to the moment when the grapes had reached maximum sugar content without beginning to rot. Timing was everything. Columella wrote detailed instructions for identifying the exact right moment, the color of the skin, the give of the flesh, the smell of the vine at dawn. Harvesting was done entirely by hand. Slaves and hired laborers moved through the vineyard with curved iron knives, cutting bunches and placing them into wicker baskets carried on their backs. The grapes were then carried to the treading floor, a wide, flat stone platform with channels cut around its edges to direct the flowing juice. Treading was the first pressing. Barefoot workers walked the grapes in steady rhythmic patterns, crushing the skins and releasing the juice. This was not random stomping. It was controlled, methodical work. The treaders often linked arms or held ropes strung overhead to maintain balance and apply even pressure without crushing the seeds, which would have released bitter tannins into the must. The juice that ran from the treading floor was collected in large clay vessels called dolia, enormous amphor-shaped containers that could hold hundreds of liters each. These were not stored above ground. They were buried in the earth of the cellar floor up to their necks, using the stable underground temperature to control the fermentation process. This was Rome's version of temperature-controlled storage, elegant, effective, and requiring no technology whatsoever beyond a shovel and good clay. After treading came the press. Remaining grape solids were loaded into a wooden screw press, one of Rome's great mechanical innovations, which applied controlled, sustained pressure to extract the last of the juice from the skins and pulp. The resulting liquid was darker, heavier, and richer in tannins than the free-run juice. Fermentation happened inside the dolia over several weeks. Roman winemakers monitored it carefully, skimming foam from the surface, adding preservatives, testing the smell and color. When fermentation slowed, the wine was transferred, using clay ladles and leather tubes, into smaller transport vessels called amphorae. These narrow, two-handled clay jars were sealed with stoppers of clay or cork, marked with the vintage and region using painted inscriptions, and either stacked in the cellar for aging or loaded onto ships and wagons for distribution across the empire. Barrels did not enter widespread use in Roman winemaking until the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, adopted from the Celtic peoples of Gaul and Germania. Before that, everything, storage, aging, transport, happened in clay. Thousands of Roman amphorae have been found across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Their contents long evaporated, but their inscriptions still readable, a paper trail of an empire's drinking habits stretching across 2,000 years. In Rome, wine was never simply a drink, it was a social contract. The Roman dinner party, the convivium, was organized entirely around wine. After the meal itself concluded, the drinking portion of the evening began, governed by a master of ceremonies called the Magister Bibendi, who determined how much water would be mixed with the wine and set the pace and tone of the evening's consumption. Drinking too fast was vulgar. Drinking too slowly was antisocial. The ritual was precise, communal, and deeply serious. Wine was central to Roman religion in ways that went far beyond mere ceremony. The god Bacchus, Dionysus in the Greek tradition, presided over wine, ecstasy, and the dissolution of social boundaries. His festivals, the Bacchanalia, were so wild and socially transgressive that the Roman Senate banned them in 186 BC, one of the very few times in Roman history that a religious festival was criminalized by the state. The Senate's concern was not moral prudishness. It was political, a festival where slaves and free citizens drank together as equals, where women led the rites, where normal social hierarchies dissolved. That was dangerous. That was the power of wine to Rome. Wine also shaped Rome's economy in ways that touched every corner of the empire. The pottery industry that produced amphorae employed thousands. The shipping networks that carried wine from Italian vineyards to Roman garrisons in Britain or Egypt were among the busiest trade routes in the ancient world. Broken amphora fragments, called Monte Testaccio in Rome, formed an artificial hill near the Tiber docks that still stands today, 35 meters high, and composed almost entirely of smashed wine and oil containers. It is a mountain made of ancient garbage. It is also one of the most extraordinary economic records ever left by a vanished civilization. The Roman wine tradition did not simply end when the empire fell, it transformed. As Roman political authority collapsed across Western Europe in the 4th and 5th centuries AD, the institutions that survived most intact were the Christian monasteries, and the monasteries needed wine, not for pleasure, but for the Eucharist. The obligation to produce wine for religious ritual meant that monastic communities across France, Germany, and Italy maintained and developed viticultural knowledge through the so-called Dark Ages, when much other Roman technical knowledge was being lost. The Benedictine monks of Burgundy, the Cistercians of the Rhine Valley, the monasteries of Bordeaux, these communities became the unlikely custodians of Roman winemaking tradition. They refined it, documented it, and over centuries transformed it into something new. The barrel, adopted from Gallic tradition, replaced the clay dolium entirely. Glassware improved. Corking techniques advanced. The thick, spiced, seawater-laced wines of ancient Rome gradually gave way to the cleaner, more precisely made wines of the medieval and then modern era. The lead that Romans added to their wine, in the form of a sweetening syrup called sapa, made by boiling grape juice in lead vessels, vanished from practice as the health consequences, dimly understood even in antiquity, became impossible to ignore. Some historians have argued that chronic lead poisoning contributed to the cognitive decline of several Roman emperors. Whether or not that claim holds up to scrutiny, the practice itself is a reminder that the history of food is also the history of what we did not yet know. Every bottle of wine opened today carries an invisible lineage stretching back through monastery cellars, Roman dolia buried in Campanian earth, Greek merchant ships, and Phoenician traders moving through the ancient Mediterranean with clay jars sealed with pine resin and beeswax. We did not invent wine. We inherited it imperfectly, incompletely, across thousands of years of catastrophe and continuity. The Romans who stomped grapes with bare feet on stone floors cut into hillsides were not primitive ancestors fumbling toward what we have now. They were sophisticated, obsessive, and deeply serious about what they were making. They mapped their vineyards. They argued about soil. They classified their vintages. They understood in their way that wine was more than fermented juice. It was civilization in a cup. It was safety and pleasure and ritual and memory all at once. Next time you pour a glass, take a moment before you drink it. Someone spent 3,000 years figuring out how to make that possible.